Mark, thanks so much for joining us on Zooming In on Hate. And for our listeners, Mark is from Hope and Courage, an Irish civil society organisation that helps communities resist organised hate. You look at how bad actors are using social media to create division in society, and you also raise awareness around how social media is being used to spread hate. Thanks so much for joining us on Zooming In on Hate.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Great to join the show.
So now, talk us through the situation in Ireland at the moment. What are you seeing in the online space, and more importantly, how is that impacting Irish society and Irish communities?
So just at the minute, I guess in Ireland, what we're seeing is the sort of the outworkings of a sort of longer pattern of anti-migrant mobilising, particularly targeting, I guess, people who are seeking kind of asylum. That's not a pattern that's unique to Ireland. We've seen that right across Europe. We've also seen that in the US. In terms of what that has looked like in Ireland has been, there's a very close, we actually wouldn't make a great distinction between the online and offline in many ways. It's just this is a space where that division maybe isn't as useful or understand, as it would have been 20 years ago. But what we're seeing is like social media being used to, and platforms being used to both promote a hateful rhetoric, promote conspiracy theories, fabricated lies, the framing of trying to create fear around an increase in sexual violence or child abductions, primarily and almost exclusively through the lens of like non-white people being the source of this. We're seeing kind of, over the last 2 years, we've seen the establishment of a network of Facebook private groups, where there's close to like 150,000 Facebook accounts across those groups. As I say, many of those groups are private, which makes it quite difficult, I guess, to hold the platforms accountable for what's happening in those groups. There's a recognisable pattern, I guess, or playbook, both in terms of trying to provoke high intensity emotions, fear, jealousy, anger, disgust being the main ones. Those sort of marshalling those kind of emotions in people through this lens of, well, the problem is the migrants that are coming in. These people should be, not repeating the narratives that they make, but basically targeting and putting blame on or creating this kind of fear around marginalised communities and communities that are minoritized. And then kind of mobilizing those fears. Once you've created a target, it's like, so what are we doing then? Trying to get people out. And often what that's looked like over the last, certainly from November 22 right through to earlier parts of this summer, which waxed and waned a little bit, but was the mobilizations in local spaces around emergency accommodation settings where people were being provided accommodation who are seeking kind of asylum or seeking refuge. We've also seen mobilizations in places where there was just rumours that a hotel was going to be used. And a lot of this, I guess, is happening within the context, not just in Ireland, but elsewhere, where you've grown inequality, generally massive kind of housing crisis. And so what we're also seeing perhaps is that legitimate social anger there is being misdirected by the right, and creating very simplistic narratives online around the causes of the housing crisis is actually immigration, which doesn't stand up statistically if you look at it at all. It's not a particularly rational argument, but at the same time it's one that the far right, who aren't particularly wedded to truth, accuracy or honesty, are able to promote because it's quite simplistic. We've seen that repertoire tactics, I guess, happen in many other countries as well. So yeah, that's kind of the main thing, I guess, in Ireland. There have been another targeted communities in terms of anti-LGBTQI hate and around kind of sexual education and in schools. Social media platforms being another vector by which misinformation, disinformation is like being spread, ranging from, schools or places where teachers are trying to groom your children. Again, this kind of narrative of like high intensity emotions being provoked. Obviously, people are, care about their kids. The idea that schools are spaces that are deliberately trying to groom children is kind of crazy. However, we are seeing kind of those type of messaging being proliferated across platforms actually as well. So, and And in terms of that tip over into the real world, I guess, and it's contradicting myself in terms of the online and offline. What we have seen post the series of elections in Ireland, where the far right political organisations weren't very successful at all at either local, European, or national, the general elections, is a retreat away from a belief in electoral solutions and an increase in sort of militant and violent tactics. So we've seen the targeting of particularly people who are made homeless by the state, and these people are also in the process of seeking asylum. And so you had a situation in many places where, in parts of Dublin, where people are living in tents, and we're seeing, actors of the far right turning up to intimidate, harass, slash tents with knives, threatening violence, filming actual violence, and actually been able to do this whilst live streaming and been able to promote the content on platforms on X, on Facebook, on TikTok. One of the challenges then in part of our work is that bit of mapping out where that's happening and trying to hold companies to account. So
it's a shocking development that we're seeing in other countries in the EU as well, of course. And how do you have a sense of what the motivation is behind those far right actors in attacking them and streaming on social media? Are they incentivized by monetization? Is it more of a movement? Is there any idea where that's going?
I guess it's a fairly diffuse movement, right? And actually unpicking this sort of separate motivations is challenging. For the political parties, generally there's political organisations. Generally, there's an ideological motivation, or there's an ideological bent on their desire to gain political power. So you would see that with groups like the National Party, which were set up by a neo-Nazi. You see that in the Irish Freedom Party, which was set up by a former employee of Nigel Farage. It's a very Farageist Islamophobic organisation. So they would have clearer rationales in terms of their own politics. And there actually is a sort of an internal coherency around it. Whilst we hate what they're about, there's a sort of an internal kind of logic perhaps to it itself on its own terms. I think one of the things that we've seen develop in Ireland is the role of influencers, which is runs alongside, I guess, the similar as we'd see influencers in social media on any other space or form, where very much there's a sort of almost like a political economy where people desire to build brand recognition. There's an economic imperative in terms of churning content out regularly to keep an audience. There's regular demands for donations or subscriptions. So there's a monetization process there in and of itself. Very often that's starting to include the platforms as part of the monetization. So for example, on X, you can pay to become a kind of verified account, and that gives you access to a wider suite of tools in order to build brand, in order to build audience and engagement. And then from advertising, we've seen monetized accounts on YouTube, I guess, there as well. And I think there is the motivation, I guess, which still is can be ideological, but I think it's a different blend of motivations whenever it becomes down to individuals who are kind of social media influencers. One of the things that we've seen perhaps develop over the course of the last 5 years is where you had particular individuals who very often seem to be almost it's their politics, reactionary, hateful politics that seek to divide. We're almost in competition with each other. Actually, it's evolved where people have found particular niches that are mutually supportive. So you have people who are regularly doing the live streams. You have others who are doing the Substack writing. You have people who make short videos that are like discussing bits of the news and TikTok videos. And so people have almost found ways to specialise in what they do within reaction movements, all again facilitated by the platforms. But that lends itself to something that looks like a much more cohesive movement, even though it's still really numerically small. It doesn't have any kind of electoral support, but it is the bit where you can see a type of maturing happening within that sort of networked space, I guess.
And is there any sense that this is inauthentic behaviour? How is there any foreign interference going on, or is it a mix of both? Is there a bit of foreign interference? Our influencers are being paid, as we saw in the US in the lead up to the election of President Trump, that there was external forces paying influencers to parrot.
There's been some, I think it was by either the Institute of Strategic Dialogue or one of the universities that was looking at sort of specifically inauthentic and bot behaviour around Conor McGregor's tweets, which showed that there was a significant amount of accounts on X outside Ireland that were involved in sort of amplifying, retweeting and using particular kind of words. I think actually the foreign influence, is much more explicit in the likes of Elon Musk openly retweeting and directly engaging with white supremacist accounts that he reinstated, or that were reinstated after he took over the platform. And so in that sense, and he was directly engaging in amplifying and encouraging Conor McGregor's unsuccessful bid to become president, or to take part in the presidential campaign. So in many ways, I think that the sort of the interference stuff is actually happening in a much more explicit and open way, even alongside and parallel to perhaps the sort of the more inauthentic bot behaviour, which is kind of actually beyond our scope as a small organisation to identify. You need significant access to data sources and APIs and stuff like that in terms of research. But the trend, I guess, is that I'd nearly separate out those two things in terms of like international influence and inauthentic behaviour, because actually what we're seeing is that far-right movements are very well connected and networked. Nowhere is that more apparent in the sort of very, very slickly coordinated attempt to normalise the idea of remigration in Europe. A term used to sort of disguise a demand for ethnic cleansing. And we've seen that happen both in a coordinated way in terms of reactionary far-right neo-Nazi and kind of fascist groups meeting up to discuss how do we normalise this. And they're organising online. They're quite clear about what they do. They're quite confident in terms of how they're approaching this. And I think that speaks more to the transnational nature of some of the sort of more reactionary, more extreme bits of politics and political organising. And I guess the concern is that the lack of, for example, within the context of platforms, we're seeing remigration being used by groups and individuals who would not be neo-Nazis themselves, right? So the context can kind of change. It's also been used by Trump very much explicitly within sort of US government policy, even though the origins came from individuals like Martin Sellner and people who are involved in the European identitarian movement, who are at the more extreme, the most extreme ends of reactionary right-wing politics. So I think that would be, one of the bigger concerns around the sort of the international influence. And I think then one additional kind of concern that's always challenging is money flows. So who's actually resourcing the sort of political movements? Who's paying for the international travel? Who's doing a lot of the sort of background coordinating, the narrative and messaging shaping that's going on? Whilst small-scale local influencers can probably, keep themselves afloat on sort of, small donations kind of coming in and buy me a coffee, it would seem absurd not to think that there's a more structured kind of approach to international funding around some of this stuff, particularly where you have successful far-right governments and right-wing governments and sort of European groupings that then are actively looking around to see where can they be seeding this where there hasn't been electoral success, I guess, the reactionary right. Ireland is one of those places where there hasn't been that success yet, so it would make sense from their perspective to be looking at how do we provide sort of sustained resources to help build that.
Yeah, and indeed, actually on the European Observatory of Online Hate dashboard, I've got a channel on Ireland is Full, because obviously that's a hashtag commonly used by far-right groups, and interestingly, the most common two words that are used in association with the hashtag Ireland is Full is hashtag MAGA, hashtag Trump. Yeah. So they are, it would suggest to me that there is a heavy heavy traffic from US accounts or accounts that are trying to align Ireland with the Trump movement.
There would be, and there's a particular strand of an emerging strand of like ethno-nationalism in Ireland, which, I mean, for your listeners, is worth saying, like, until about 2016, there was no far-right political organisations in Ireland. Not that it didn't exist previously. There's always been iterations, but certainly, from the late, the start of the 2000s, it was around 2016 before we started seeing formal far-right political organisations that weren't just like micro groups of people. Right? That's not unrelated to the emergence of kind of social media perhaps as well. But one of the things that those ethno-nationalist movements seek to do is try to create a continuity with like Irish nationalism and republicanism, which was very internationalist and anti-colonialist in its outlook, quite counterposed to the ethno-nationalism and white supremacism of these kind of currents, small currents in Ireland at the minute. But that also has a message to send back to the sort of the Irish diaspora, reactionary Irish diaspora, I guess, in America, right? So there's an economic imperative to claim to have historical nationalist and republican heritage, because that sells very well for US donors, right? The small number of donors who are interested in funding that type of like really reactionary thought, and also they what we're seeing is the use of social media to propagate this through the use of visual tools, of like using old propaganda videos from like historical anti-colonial struggles or from the provisionals during the Troubles in the North, and this bit of like trying to create through video, text and images some historical continuum, when in fact these organisations, as I said, they've come around from 2016. And so like many other far-right groups, myth making or lying, whichever way you want, is a kind of key part of the work that they do in order to convince people of a particular type of like legitimacy or historical continuum, or that they come from like a real long tradition or historical context, rather than being like kind of creatures of the internet.
Yeah. Very, very interesting, Mark. It's really fascinating to get your take on it. And now I know a really important part of Hope and Courage's work is not just to keep an eye on things, but you mobilise communities and you build resilience. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about how you do that and how it's going?
Yeah, so like a key part of the work, and actually the mainstay of the work really is, it's not just about trying to understand and have a good read around what the far right are doing. It's actually working with communities to build resilience in communities. Very often what that looks like is what we would have called kind of community responses, where we can see sort of mobilizations being called, or particular plans to target an emergency accommodation setting or something like that. And so very often we'd be reaching out to people who are living locally, reaching out to people who are involved in the sort of seeking asylum process, and volunteer and other solidarity groups that are working in that space, I guess. Getting people in a room, getting us talking to each other, like in terms of what, very much trying to create spaces of solidarity, one of the things that where reactionaries and those that are trying to seek to create division in communities, one of the things they're quite good at is kind of trying to create fear. So really going in and being able to explain some of the dynamics, looking at sort of past experiences, and helping people be grounded in something that can feel quite fearful. And in many cases is, particularly if you're someone who's seeking asylum, like it is, to feel that you're kind of being threatened or under attack from somebody else is clearly real. And actually that's developed then over time, and at this point we've developed a quite useful practice in and around that. My colleagues have been, they're flat to the mat with it, but it's like there's a lot of learning that's happened with that. And really a big chunk of what we look at now as well is like co-learning. So it's like now we do have many spaces around the country where there's been responses. We have groups that have come together as for all groups or welcoming groups, that actually have some kind of structure and longevity about them. And many of these groups now are like talking to each other. So you're building like, it is kind of a bit of like community building practice, I guess, as well, which is not, it's kind of found elsewhere in sort of community practice in Ireland. But it is that bit of like trying to support and engender the actual work that's happening on the ground by people that isn't necessarily being led by us, but we're kind of very often just holding the space to help pull stuff together initially, and then it has a longer term benefit.
And are you feeling supported? Do you feel there's an appetite for the kind of community resilience that you're building? What's the reception like?
I mean, I think just looking at stuff over the last 2 or 3 years, I think it's fair to say from the early part of 2023, like there was a lot of kind of fear. The types and scale of mobilisations across the country, the types of numbers that were turning out, was new, and with that newness comes a sort of very specific type of like fear unknown or whatever, I guess, as well. And I think since that time, there's been a sort of a broad and rich kind of response, both at community levels, at a national level, trade union movement starting to take stuff kind of seriously. I guess within sort of public sector, local government taking it seriously. And so I think that there has been a bit of a shift in terms of a normalisation that far right politics and the anti-migrant organising is probably part and is around for a while, but that it's not standing on its own two legs and not being countered. I think there's a recognition that the vast majority of people and communities right across the country have no interest in this, and some of the work that's been happening over the last few years has given kind of voice and experience and space for that stuff to kind of grow and flourish. So I'd be more hopeful now than perhaps I would have been 2 or 3 years ago, given the newness of things,
Yeah, I mean the scenes from the riots in Dublin, as a fellow Irish person, sent shivers down my spine. We'd never ever seen anything like this before, so it has galvanised support, I suppose, for the work that I hope that for the work that you're doing.
It certainly brought a wider recognition to, just in the context of that riot in November 23, a lot more public visibility to perhaps some experiences that many communities were feeling already, which is a rise in temperature, which was a sort of an increase in sort of targeted attacks, threats, violence, intimidation, just harassment. And so I think for many communities, particularly minoritized communities, they felt that already. I think the result of the riot was that it put that question on a national scale in the public imagination. Importantly, one of the first responses from the state was to renominate Algeria as a safe country. So it actually moved the politics of the sitting government to the right as a reaction to that, rather than to take seriously the idea that there are those who are willing to marshal violence in the streets on the basis of their hateful politics. But as you say, I think it has kind of raised attention, but also I think alongside, there's that specific event, but I think it actually has been the sort of the long and hard slog of communities right across the country who are quite happily standing up now and working together. And we're seeing that happening, so that's a really kind of key part of it.
And of course, it's the situation online isn't getting better in any country in the EU for sure, and I suppose that's the most important area we're looking at. Bad actors are bigger, bolder, multiplied, some authentic, some inauthentic. Do you see any positive green shoots coming through that can give us a little bit of hope for the future?
I think perhaps one of the more positive things is us all being a bit realistic about what's happening. So I think there's I guess the hope that in practice, the effect, for example, given to the Digital Services Act, the DSA, will have some sort of meaningful impact in reining in companies. I think we all are being realistic about what the potential of that actually is. But even just in, the time chatting to peers and colleagues and, organizations across within the network here, that sort of recognition that actually it isn't just simply a question of like content moderation or regulation, that actually these companies are sort of almost like political entities at this stage. They wield a tremendous amount of power that have a tilting effect in democratic spaces in ways that is beyond the sort of the immediacy of like particular instances of hate speech or particular instances of hateful behavior, content moderation. And I think that it's inspiring, it is inspiring and encouraging that we're starting to see some of that as a sort of an analysis around kind of power and democracy rather than just merely, as I say, kind of content moderation is quite hopeful, because I think, what we've seen is the sort of the close proximity. For example, I think what's happening in the States is a very clear bellwether of what's going on. I think what's happening in X is a clear bellwether of what's going on. I don't think they're just outriders. I think it's the way in which, and this is perhaps more personal reflection than an organizational reflection, just to say, so you feel free to take it out. But I do think that the close political proximity, the ease within which any conversation around or framing around human rights that used to be part of social media is just now gone. And actually this kind of manufactured a cover of trying to conflate freedom of speech with like hateful activity is deliberately confusing and conflating and used as a way to, minimizing hate and harm on platforms costs money, right? Costs money. You have to resource it. It's quite clear the platforms are making decisions that they don't want to be resourcing that in the same way. I think one of the takeaways in the last 2 or 3 years is recognizing that within the companies themselves, their terms and conditions, their community guidelines are entirely politically contingent. So what can we get away with? And I think the bit of that's happening at a board level. So there are many people that we engage with directly who are like really sound people, they're doing their job, but actually what's happening at a sort of a C-suite level is an absolute retreat from protecting communities from hate, I think.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right, and there's no hiding it anymore. And what I think is coming to the fore now is a fundamental, whether it's intentional or not, misunderstanding about the value of regulation. It's being kind of manipulated and targeted as if it's a political tool. It's only a political tool if the social media platforms allow it to be a political tool. What we in Europe want from regulation is safety, security, democracy, the freedom to live without being threatened online or social media spaces being used to radicalize and kind of divide societies. So let's see if it's intentional or not intentional. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. But it kind of lacks an understanding of the principles of what we want the DSA to do, I think, in Europe.
Yeah, I agree.
So, thanks a million, Mark, for joining us on Zooming In on Hate. It's been great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, likewise. Yeah, it's been great to finally get chatting to you guys.
Brilliant.